A little girl left home on a Friday afternoon in March 1959 and never came back. She was 9 years old, 60 pounds. She had 7 boxes of campfire mints, a plan to earn a badge, and a grandmother waiting at home with dinner on the way. By morning, her face was on every television in Spokane. By the end of the week, the entire country knew her name. The man who took her knew her street. He knew her neighborhood. He may have watched her leave, and for 62 years he remained completely invisible to every detective, every database, every tip line that tried to find him. He was not hiding in another city. He was not living under a false name. He was right there, in the same city, on the same streets. He even showed up to help search for her. His name was John Ray Hoff, and this is the story of how a sealed glass jar sitting forgotten in an evidence locker, a forensic scientist who grew up hearing a dead girl's name as a childhood warning, and a daughter who walked into a police station already knowing the truth, finally dragged him into the light 62 years after he thought he had gotten away with it. But before we get to any of that, you need to understand who Candy Rogers was. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to this channel. Spokane, Washington in 1959 was a city that had not yet learned to be afraid. West Central Spokane was a working-class neighborhood of modest homes and familiar routines. Children walked to school alone. Neighbors kept their doors unlocked past dark. Nobody set a timer when a kid stepped outside because nobody had been given a reason to. That kind of trust does not survive what happened on March 6, 1959. But on that afternoon, it was still completely intact. Candy Rogers lived with her mother, Elaine, a high school history and PE teacher, in an apartment sitting above a corner grocery store on West Mission Avenue. Her grandparents lived right next door. She had a dog named Shep who followed her everywhere she went. At 4'4" and 60 pounds, she was small even for her age, quiet and observant by nature. But inside the Campfire Girls program, she had found something that pulled her forward. She was a bluebird, the youngest rank in the organization, and the structure of it suited her perfectly. Goals were clearly defined, progress was visible, badges were earned through real effort. For a reserved 9-year-old, that kind of framework was not just appealing, it was everything. March 6th was the first day of the Campfire Mint selling season, and Candy had been thinking about it for days. The goal was straightforward. Sell enough boxes to earn a sales badge and put herself in the running for a free week at summer camp. She was out of school by 3:15, at her troop leader's house by 3:30, and back home with her 7 boxes shortly after. 7 was her limit. She was too small to carry more. She had 45 minutes before the official 4 o'clock start time, and she used all of them. She sat with her grandmother and ate an oatmeal cookie. She let Shep climb all over her. She mapped out her route out loud. Which neighbors would she visit first? Which ones she was certain would buy without hesitation? Which ones might take a little convincing? She was not nervous about any of it. She was excited, she had a plan, and she was ready. At exactly 4 o'clock, Candy Rogers stepped outside into the cold March air and started knocking on doors. She never knocked on her own door again. The rule in that house was simple: be home before the streetlights come on. In early March in the Pacific Northwest, that means before 5:30. When that time passed with no sign of her, her grandfather stepped outside to look. He checked with neighbors. He walked the surrounding blocks. Nobody had seen her recently enough to be useful. When her mother, Elaine, arrived home from a hair appointment and found an empty apartment, the unease of the past hour became something much more urgent. The family spread through the streets. Police were called before nightfall. The search was complicated from the very beginning by a cruel coincidence. Candy had not been the only campfire girl out that evening. Dozens of other girls in identical uniforms had been moving through the same neighborhood that afternoon, carrying the same boxes of mints. Witnesses remembered seeing children. They could not say with any certainty which child had been Candy. The trail was already blurring before it had even properly formed. Then at 9 o'clock that night it suddenly sharpened. On Pettit Drive on the slope of a hill, in the neighborhood called Doomsday Hill, searchers came across a campfire, mint boxes spread across the road, not dropped, not left behind in a stumble, scattered, distributed across the pavement in a pattern that could only mean one thing. Someone had thrown them one by one from a moving vehicle as it drove away fast. The trail they left pointed south across the Fort George Wright Bridge and then simply ended. A partial fingerprint was carefully lifted from one of the boxes and sent to the FBI. It was never matched to anyone. But those boxes told investigators everything they needed to know. Candy Rogers had not wandered off. She had not gotten lost. Someone had taken her and left in a hurry, and the trail had gone cold at the edge of a bridge. By the following morning, more than 1,200 people had arrived before sunrise to look for one child. 1,200 volunteers, Marines, Boy Scouts, postal workers, utility crews, neighbors on horseback. The U.S. Air Force deployed helicopters to sweep the river and the surrounding terrain from the air. A command post was established at the base of Doomsday Hill, right where the trail had gone cold the night before. They had no digital tools, no GPS, no way to track a phone signal. They had scattered mint boxes, one unidentified fingerprint, and 1,200 people who refused to go home without her. On the second day of the search, one of those Air Force helicopters struck a set of high-tension power lines above the Spokane River and went down into the water. 5 men were on board. 3 of them did not survive: Airman Marles D. Ray, Staff Sergeant William A. McDonald, Lieutenant Kenneth G. Fout. 3 men died in that river searching for one little girl. Spokane was now carrying 2 Greek reefs and had answers for neither, and Candy was still missing. The days that followed were defined by silence and dead ends. Tips came in from across the country, hundreds then thousands. Every single one was followed. Every person with a relevant criminal history in the region was located and questioned. In 1959, there was no centralized sex offender registry. Investigators worked from paper records, informants, and instinct. Several individuals were developed as serious suspects. None could be connected to Candy's disappearance with anything solid. 16 days passed. On March 21st, 2 airmen from Fairchild Air Force Base, out hunting near a rock quarry on Old Trails Road, 7 miles from Candy's home, stopped in their tracks. Beside a tree sat a pair of small girls' shoes, not thrown, not scattered the way the mint boxes had been, placed, set down carefully side by side as though someone had taken deliberate time to leave them just so. The men went back to base and reported what they had found. Officers were at that quarry before first light the next morning. Within minutes of beginning their search, one of them moved aside a covering of branches and dead pine needles. Beneath it, approximately 50 yards from the road, was Candy Rogers. She had been buried there, covered carefully, left in the kind of place where she might never have been found. Captain Richard Obering was among the officers standing in that clearing on the morning of March 22, 1959. He was a young man then. He would carry what he saw there for the rest of his life, and he would be old and retired before he finally heard the name of the person who had put her there. What the medical examiner documented was precise and devastating. Candy had been strangled. The ligature used was a strip of fabric torn directly from her own slip, the undergarment she had been wearing when she left home that Friday afternoon. Her ankles had been bound with another strip torn from the same garment. A marking around her waist indicated she had likely been restrained with a rope at some point. Though no rope was recovered at the scene, she had been sexually assaulted. Every piece of physical evidence was carefully catalogued and preserved. And at some point during that process, an investigator whose name was never recorded made a decision that no protocol required and no existing science could justify. They took Candy's underwear, placed it inside a glass mason jar, and sealed the lid shut. That person had no way of knowing what they were actually doing. There was no scientific framework in 1959 for understanding what biological material locked inside an airtight glass container might one day be made to yield. Glass does not degrade. Glass does not breathe or absorb or interact with what is stored inside it. That sealed jar sitting in an evidence locker would protect biological material across 6 decades of time in a way that nothing else could have managed. The investigator who sealed it could not have known what they were saving. They saved it anyway. And that single anonymous act of careful preservation would turn out to be the only reason this case was ever solved. The investigation that followed became the largest case file in the history of the Spokane Police Department. For years, it was active and exhaustive and ultimately circular. And then a name emerged that seemed to bring everything into sharp focus. Hugh Byron Morse was a violent predator with a specific and well-documented pattern. He targeted young girls engaged in door-to-door sales. In California, 4 years before Candy's murder, he had been arrested attempting to molest 2 Girl Scouts during a cookie sale. The echo of Candy's case was almost impossible to look past. He was operating in the Spokane area in early 1959. The behavioral and geographic overlap was striking. Less than a year after Candy's body was found, Morse raped and murdered 2 women in Spokane, then continued across the country committing at least 7 more violent crimes before a neighbor in Minnesota recognized his face on an FBI wanted poster in 1961 and called it in. He died in a Minnesota prison in April 2003, serving two life sentences. The profile fit Candy's case almost perfectly, and then investigators found the detail that seemed to seal it entirely. At crime scenes connected to Morse across multiple states, investigators had consistently recovered grape-flavored gum, frequently enough and consistently enough that it had become a recognized signature linking him to his offenses. During Candy's autopsy, a detective had noted a purple stain on her clothing. Examined closely, it appeared to carry a grape scent. That stain was never chemically tested, never forensically confirmed as anything beyond a visual observation. But over the years and then decades, as Morse's history as a serial killer became more thoroughly documented, that untested detail became the foundation of the entire case against him. An observation became an assumption. An assumption hardened into something that functioned like certainty. For 40 years, every detective who picked up the Candy Rogers file worked it with Hugh Morse as the answer. In 2001, Detective Mindy Connolly decided that assumptions were no longer sufficient. She submitted Candy's preserved clothing to a forensic laboratory. Scientists worked through the evidence, and from material that had been sealed inside that glass jar for 42 years, they isolated a semen sample and constructed a complete DNA profile. For the first time since 1959, the investigation had something biological and irrefutable. They tested it against Hugh Morse. No match. 40 years of investigative certainty dissolved in a single laboratory result. The stain, the gum, the geography, the behavioral history. None of it was evidence of anything. The real perpetrator's DNA was not in any system anywhere. The profile was entered into CODIS, the National Criminal DNA Database, which holds the genetic profiles of convicted offenders across the country. It returned 0 matches, complete silence. In 42 years of active investigation, the real killer's name had not appeared in a single document. Not a tip, not a report, not a passing mention anywhere. He had been invisible the entire time. The case had nowhere left to go. Detectives continued to surface persons of interest over the following years and compare their profiles against the DNA. But the active trail was cold in a way that felt to everyone who worked the file like a door that might never open again. Brittany Wright was born and raised in Spokane in a household where Candy Rogers was spoken about the way that the city had spoken about her for decades. Not as a historical footnote, as a warning. Her parents told her the story the way Spokane parents had been telling it since 1959. Watch where you go. Remember what happened to that little girl. Wright grew up, studied forensic science, and joined the Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory Division. In 2018, Candy's file landed on her desk. For Wright, this was not just another cold case. This was the case she had been hearing about her entire life. The timing is connected to something much larger. That same year, the arrest of the Golden State Killer showed law enforcement agencies across the entire country what forensic genetic genealogy was capable of. The technique worked by uploading crime scene DNA to consumer ancestry databases, identifying biological relatives of the unknown suspect among millions of registered users, and then tasking genealogists with building family trees through public records until a single individual emerged as the source. The moment that the arrest made international headlines, cold case investigators everywhere pulled out their oldest unsolved files and asked the same question. Could this work for us? Spokane asked it immediately about Candy. Wright located the DNA sample that had been sitting in cold storage since 2001 and ran a diagnostic analysis. 6 decades had taken a serious toll. The material had degraded significantly and carried contamination that complicated any attempt at processing. She and the lead detective submitted it to a private genealogy laboratory in 2020. The package that arrived at the lab contained a crushed shipping container. The tube inside had been damaged in transit. DNA had leaked out. Wright and her detective were devastated. A second careful submission was prepared and sent. The laboratory examined what it received and returned its decision. Too degraded. Beyond what their technology could handle, they declined the case. That rejection was close to the end of the road. CODIS had returned nothing. Every traditional investigative lead had been exhausted. If forensic genealogy could not be performed with what remained, the case was effectively finished. Wright kept working. She had learned of a laboratory in Texas called Othram that had built its entire purpose around exactly this kind of problem. Degraded samples, contaminated evidence, biological material that other facilities turned away without a second look. Othram had developed a proprietary method called forensic-grade genome sequencing. designed from the ground up to process the kind of evidence that conventional laboratories could not touch. Wright contacted them in February 2021. She described what remained of the sample. By this point, she would later say it had been reduced to the very last drops of usable material. There was nothing held in reserve. If Othram could not extract something from it, there was simply nothing left to extract. They said they would try. She packaged up what was left and sent it to Texas. 6 months passed. Othram delivered their results. From what had arrived in that final submission, they had constructed a genealogical profile strong enough to run against an ancestry database. The database returned familial connections. When the genealogists finished tracing the family trees, those connections produced 3 names that remained, 3 brothers, all deceased. All lifelong residents of Spokane: John Ray Hoff, James Andrew Hoff, Terry Allen Hoff. Genealogical DNA cannot separate brothers from one another. Their genetic signatures read as nearly identical when traced through a family tree. To determine which of the 3 men had left his DNA on Candy's clothing, investigators needed to find someone still living who carried that same bloodline. Of the 3 brothers, only one had children. Detective Storment picked up the phone. Kathy Hoff had spent her entire life with a particular story about her father, a man who struggled, a man who lost his battle with his own darkness too young and left his family to build their grief around his absence. Depression was the explanation. It was the version of him the family had lived with and accepted for 50 years. When the detective called and identified himself as a cold case investigator who needed her help, she did not sit passively and wait. In the 45 minutes between that phone call and her arrival at Spokane Police Headquarters, Kathy went online. She searched. She found the story of a 9-year-old girl who had walked out of her home on West Mission Avenue on a Friday afternoon in March 1959, carrying 7 boxes of campfire mints. She walked through the doors of that police building already knowing why she had been called. She gave her DNA without being asked twice. 2 days later, the results came back. The DNA recovered from Candy's clothing was 2.9 million times more likely to belong to a biological relative of Kathy Hoff than to any random individual in the general population. The evidence pointed directly to her father. Investigators were not finished. John Hoff was dead. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no defense attorney. That meant the burden of certainty rested entirely on the science itself. They needed to be as certain as technology could make them. A court warrant was obtained, and on September 23, 2021, the body of John Ray Hoff was exhumed. On October 1st, the direct comparison was complete. The probability that the DNA on Candy Rogers' clothing had come from anyone other than John Ray Hoff was 25 quintillion to 1. The number 25 followed by 18 zeros. That is not a figure that permits doubt of any kind. Now, for the first time, investigators could look at exactly who John Ray Hoff actually was. He was born in Spokane in August 1938 and grew up on West College Avenue. He was not a stranger passing through. He was local, familiar, unremarkable. The kind of man a neighborhood absorbs without question. At 16, he had escaped a state juvenile reform facility near Olympia and been caught trying to flee toward Yakima. The Army absorbed him at 17 and stationed him at Nike missile defense installations built to protect Fairchild Air Force Base. He was assigned to defend his own city. On March 6, 1959, he lived at 221 West Broadway Avenue. Candy Rogers lived 1 mile away on West Mission Avenue. In 1961, 2 years after Candy's murder, Hoff was arrested in West Spokane on a charge of second-degree assault. He had seized a woman, torn her clothing from her body, used those same garments to bind her and to strangle her, and fled when something interrupted him before he could finish. She survived. The method was identical to what had been done to Candy Rogers in every specific detail: the ligature, the binding material, the source. Her own clothing turned into a weapon against her. The only difference between those 2 crimes was that something stopped him in 1961 and nothing stopped him in 1959. He served 6 months. 6 months for what he had done. The Army processed a dishonorable discharge. He drifted between jobs after that: door-to-door cutlery salesman, lumber yard worker, a stint at a meat packing plant, where a chemical accident left a permanent scar burned into his face. He was not building anything. He was simply moving through time, waiting for it to run out. And then there is the detail about John Hoff that does not release you once you know it. He had a stepsister. In 1959, she was 10 years old and a campfire girl. She had been assigned within the program as Candy Rogers' big sister, the older mentor paired with the younger Bluebird, responsible for guiding her through the organization. She knew Candy personally. She was fond of her. When Candy disappeared and Spokane fell apart with grief, this girl was devastated. She sat beside her stepbrother John and she wept. She told him how much she missed her little campfire sister. She described how unbearable the not knowing was. She poured her grief out to him directly. He sat there and said nothing. He already knew exactly where Candy was. John Hoff died in 1970. He shot himself in the head. The date he chose was his daughter's birthday, the day Kathy turned 9 years old. The same age, Candy Rogers had been on the afternoon he took her life. Whether that timing carried deliberate meaning, or represented something darker still, or was a coincidence that cannot be cleanly read either way, he left no explanation. He took everything with him. When investigators located his burial records, the room went quiet. For 51 years, John Ray Hoff had been interred in the same cemetery as Candy Rogers. While her family came to stand at her grave year after year, across 5 decades, while they visited her headstone and carried questions they could not answer, her killer lay in the same ground yards away, in the same silence, in the same city. Nobody knew. When Hoff's family learned this, they did not need to be asked what to do. They arranged without hesitation to have his remains relocated to a different cemetery, so that Candy could rest without him near her. It was the only thing within their power to give, and they gave it. When Candy's cousin Joanne heard about that decision, she could not find words for a moment. Hoff's stepsister, now in her 70s, was tracked down by Detective Stormont after the case closed. He sat with her and told her what the DNA had confirmed. She was, in his words, absolutely heartbroken. She had carried the grief of Candy's loss her entire adult life, grief she had always understood as the senseless cruelty of an unknown stranger. Learning that the person she had wept to, the person who had sat beside her absorbing every one of those tears without so much as flinching, had been responsible for all of it from the very beginning. There are no words adequate to what that realization requires a person to hold. On November 19, 2021, the Spokane Police Department held a press conference, and the case was officially declared solved. 62 years, 8 months, and 13 days after Candy Rogers walked out of her front door for the last time. Detective Stormont stood at that podium and called the Candy Rogers investigation the Mount Everest of cold cases, the one they could never seem to overcome, the one nobody ever forgot. A videotaped statement from Kathy Hoff was played for the room. She did not look for distance from what her father had done. She looked directly into the camera and said she was deeply sorry for what he did. He took Candy's life horribly. She said she hoped it gave Candy's memory some peace to know that even without a trial, even without a sentence, even without any conventional punishment, his name now had this on it permanently. The record reflected the truth, and that truth was not going anywhere. And then she said something that cut through everything else in that room. She said she had spent most of her life believing her father died because he was depressed. She said now she understood the truth. He was not depressed. He was evil. His death was not a surrender to darkness. It was an escape from what he deserved. There was no courtroom, no jury, no moment where the law looked John Ray Hoff in the eye and called him what he was. He had been dead for 50 years and had escaped all of it. The only accountability left was the kind his daughter was offering from in front of a camera. His name is permanently joined to his crime. The truth stated plainly by his own blood for as long as records exist. It is not justice, but it is nothing. Richard Obering sat in the audience at that press conference. The retired captain who had knelt in a forest clearing on a cold March morning 6 decades earlier and moved aside the branches that concealed what John Hoff had left behind. He had carried that image through his entire career, through his retirement, through the long years when the answer seemed like it might never come. He was still alive to hear it spoken out loud. He said he thanked God he had lived long enough to see the end of this case. Detective Stormont was asked how many hours of investigative work the Candy Rogers case had consumed across 62 years. He did not attempt a number. He said it could not be measured that way. It had to be measured in careers. 3 generations of detectives had worked this file. 3 generations had passed it to the next with the same unspoken instruction: do not let her go. The last generation did not. Candy's cousin Joanne wiped tears from her face and said what needed to be said. She said Candy's loss was just a horrible loss, that she was so cute, that she didn't have much time. She didn't have much time. Candy Rogers was 9 years old. She had a grandmother who gave her oatmeal cookies on slow afternoons, and a dog named Shep who never left her side, and a street full of neighbors she was genuinely looking forward to visiting. She had a badge she was working toward. a summer she was already imagining, and a future that belonged to her completely and entirely by right. A 20-year-old man who lived 1 mile away and spent 62 years invisible to everyone who tried to find him took all of it from her on a cold Friday afternoon in March 1959. We will never know who she would have become. What we know is that 1,200 people came before sunrise to find her. Those 3 men went into a river searching for her and did not come back. That a forensic scientist who grew up hearing her name as a warning sent the very last drops of evidence to one final laboratory and refused to accept that the answer was gone. That the daughter of the man who killed her sat down in front of a camera and made sure his name would never exist in the public record without what he did attached to it forever. 62 years, 8 months, 13 days. Candy Rogers waited long enough. She doesn't have to wait anymore.